This is yet another interesting quad to me, not because of the quad itself, but because of where it came from. So this quad comes from a brand that's brand new. It's called Geelang. And what's really interesting about this brand is that it was developed or created by the previous Happy Models product designer, lead product designer. So this is a very common thing to happen in China, where people work for companies, learn everything about the company and how they do everything, and make relationships with all the manufacturers, and then they branch off and make their own company doing exactly the same thing. This is where Aomway came from. It was a previous engineer at Fat Shark. This is also where Cadix came from. It was a previous engineer at either Runchem or Foxier. They both say that the person worked for them, so maybe they work for both companies. And a number of other companies have started this way just in FPV. So I'm sure it's happening much, much more across other industries as well. Anyways, this quad is actually pretty interesting because it's a whoop style quad. It's a Cinewhoop, and it's a true whoop style Cinewhoop, which means it's got the molded frame and everything is all molded and such. And typically these just don't perform well at all. This is not dissimilar from the rest, but it does perform a little bit differently than what I've tried in the past. Now, the previous Cinewhoop thing that I flew, which was the Cineking, the GEP-RC Cineking, I still think is the best Cinewhoop thing that I've flown so far. But this is not bad. It just has one significant kind of flaw to it. And that is that the flight time is just not very good, and the weight of it is just a little bit much. But before going over that, let's go over all the parts. So first thing I want to point out is, okay, let me plug it in and show you probably the coolest part of this quad. It's got these lights that go up and down the side, which just looks super cool to me. I'm not really a huge fan of RGB, but hey, who doesn't like some RGB lights that do things? So that's just really fun. I had to show that off. The next thing is that if you take a look at the shape of this quad, this isn't a new shape. We've seen this shape from Happy Model. Clearly you can tell that the designer came from Happy Model. But what's really interesting about this shape is that it kind of reminds me of the alien crafts from Mass Effect, which I remember from my Mass Effect days of when I was playing that game a long time ago, but it just looks really cool because it reminds me of that. Anyways, moving on, it's using the Tarsier camera, which I've tried many of, and at this point I've tried over a dozen of them, and surprisingly, this is the one product from Cadix that I have. A giant bee just flew past me. A giant wasp. This is the one product from Cadix that I have tested a lot of, and they have all been consistent. They've all been consistently crap, but they've all been consistent. They all work. The user experience is really awful on them. The HD feed on them, in my opinion, is just not that fantastic. The light handling is not really great, and the field of view is just a little bit too narrow for my taste, but it's fine. It's about as good as you're going to get in any kind of a split kind of product in this category. The FPV view, however, on the Tarsier is phenomenal, and I've told this to Cadix so many times, as have many other reviewers as well. I don't know why they don't take just the FPV camera and stick it in a standalone Nano camera. It would be incredible and would really make my toothpick class a lot better. Anyways, Tarsier is something we know and we've already been aware of. The other parts of it are, I'll talk about the most interesting other part, which are the motors. So these motors, the designer, this company designer, he told me that he actually worked with RCN Power to make these motors. So these are essentially the RCN Power 1204 5000 kV, which is the same motor that I use on my toothpick class, except that I can't really stock this motor because the mounting pattern is, once again, a brand new mounting pattern that they decided to make up. It's actually different than the RCN Power mounting pattern, the 3-hole mounting pattern that they make, which is really odd. Yeah, I don't know why these companies keep making up these stupid mounting patterns. I'm also not a fan of the screws on the prop shaft. I forgot to say that in the previous review about the Twig. I really don't know why people like these screws on the props. The 2mm press fit shafts that I've worked on and developed for my toothpick class, they really work out really, really nicely, and I would urge people to just give them a try. If you're weary, just give it a shot. I bet you're gonna like it because you don't have to fiddle with these little screws anymore. The rest of the quad is it's kind of interesting. So this guy is probably not going to be using the Happy model electronics, and he's not in here. This is actually a Supra F4 board, and I haven't actually seen or used the Supra product in quite a while. Maybe they've still been making products, but I wasn't aware. They're kind of the low end. They're kind of the same tier as Happy model, and this is pretty similar in that the ESC performance is not the best. Not the best. It's adequate. It's kind of okay. Just not the best. It works. That's about all I can say about it. I don't know if it's going to burn out or not. And something really odd is that this is a 4S quad that has no capacitor. And in my experience on 5-inch and such, I don't know if the capacitors actually do a whole lot, but the guys that do electronics say that they do, so I use them just in good practice. On these little ones, I mean, I've just gotten used to having a capacitor, and it kind of feels a little unsafe without one, so it's interesting that they just omitted one completely. The VTX on here is what looks like a 20x20 VTX. It is a VTX 5840. I don't remember where that is from, but you can see there. VTX 5840. I believe it's a 20x20 VTX. Actually works really well. The VTX is really, really nice on this. The receiver on here is a clone of an FR Sky receiver, and that also works great. One thing I would point out is that you cannot access the USB port without taking this bottom plate off, which is also G10. It's not even carbon. It's interesting they decided to use G10 instead of carbon. I also don't know why they didn't decide to make the hole for the USB port just a little bit bigger so you can fit a darn wire in there. I mean, they're just cutting this plate, and it's also G10, so it has no directionality. They could have just made it a little bit wider. Go figure. China doesn't bother using their products. But okay, let's get to the flight performance and how it actually performs. So this thing flies really nicely. I'm not a huge fan of the props that they use, but they do work totally fine, and they are especially decent ducted whoop style props, so that's great. So when I took this thing out of the box and I flipped it over, I noticed that it came with a 260 milliamp 4S battery. Now, this immediately killed the product for me because I really dislike these tiny little cells. It's anything from 250 to 350 milliamps. To me, is a really fickle little cell, especially when you load up the cell count into 3, 4S. I mean, even 2S is not that great on these batteries. And that kind of kills the product for me because it flies really nicely with this battery. Actually really nice, really great grip, really great control. It's really like nice, and you got good altitude control. Everything is really great about the product, even though it weighs quite a bit. So I'll weigh it for you. The bare product weighs 85 grams alone, just the bare frame. With the battery on top, that is with the 260 milliamp battery, that is 116 grams. Now, the problem is that you can barely get 1 minute of flight time on this battery, and actually the moment you take off, you start getting low voltage warnings. So that's not really going to work out for us. And even the company says that they intended this quad to be run with a 450 milliamp 4S battery, not a 260 milliamp 4S battery. They only included this small battery to save costs on the larger battery, which they should have not included the battery at all and just recommended the 450 milliamp battery. Go figure, Chinese logic. Who knows? Anyways, this battery is pretty useless on this quad. However, it does fly really, really nicely with this battery. When you put what I have is a 520 milliamp 4S battery on there, the weight goes up to 140 grams. Now, keep in mind that these are 2-inch props. And I know it's a Cinewhoop and it's not intended to fly really nicely and smoothly and acrobatically, but when you put this kind of load and you put so much pressure on these motors to be able to perform, your throttle control, your altitude control becomes really sketchy, and it becomes really hard to fly this thing. Even then, if you try to fly it with this larger battery, you still only get about 2 to 2.5 minutes of flight time, which it's just not that great. And it doesn't work well on 3S at all. Even going with a small 3S battery just doesn't work. It just does not have enough kV for 3S, and it weighs too much. Even if it had the right kV, it would be drawing an excessive amount of watts on 3S, because you're always going to be at the top of the throttle, so it's just going to be drawing, and the efficiency is going to be awful, just awful. So this quad flies really nicely. It's just unfortunate that it's taken down by this unfortunate power issue because it's overloaded for the small props and the style of the quad. The frame is great. Everything else about the quad is totally fine. I mean, it's reasonable for a whooped product. It's just that. And I mean, it's a good try for first product from this guy. I'm sure he didn't do everything at Happy Model, but the motors and prop and frame and all that stuff is actually really great. If they removed the tarsier and all that stuff and just put a plain whoop camera on there and dropped about 30 grams off this thing, it would actually fly really nicely, especially because these motors are awesome. But yeah, it's kind of like a neutral rating from me. While it does fly really nicely, I would recommend the Cine King from GepRC over this thing, because that thing flew really, really, really well, and it had good flight time, and it had all, it was just really well balanced quad. Take care, floss your teeth. Lots of things coming. I've just been incredibly super duper ultra busy. The things are being restocked at the FPV Cycle store this week soon as well, and there's just so much that I'm working on. Stay tuned. Lots and lots of things coming. Bye.